When a woman claiming to be a missing girl came forward 22 years later, she was quickly deemed an imposter. Investigators had been working on her case, and just a month prior, it was declared a homicide investigation. The missing 13-year-old stepfather was theorized to be her killer, but now she was coming home. Or was she? You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I am Brooke Makenna, and today's case is a wild ride, and it took 22 years for answers to come forward, and then they weren't sure that those were the actual answers in this investigation. There is still so much mystery surrounding this case. However, there are some pretty deep and dark theories that we will get into as well. Now, this case is actually not spoken about a lot. It's the case of Mary Louise Day, and 48 Hours actually did an investigation into this, one of the very few that actually covered this case. So I will link their episode down below if you would like to watch that. Now let's take a quick moment for our sponsor, Hungry Root. Hungry Root is for fresh, healthy, high-quality groceries sent straight to your door. It's as easy as a takeout delivery service with much more healthier options. I was amazed at how many healthy foods I had never seen before that were available with Hungry Root and that I've actually now tried and love. They have the most in-depth quiz for a delivery service that I've ever found to find foods that you will actually want to be trying. From meals to snacks, they have everything, and once they have your suggestions, then they build your cart for you, but even then your order is still customizable by you. And whatever groceries you choose that come to your door, Hungry Root will recommend recipes for you to use those different ingredients in different meals. They describe themselves as a personal assistant for healthy living, and it's completely accurate. And I was really excited to be able to share this with you guys, especially because I found two new favorites, which were the chickpea cookie dough and the cauliflower linguine. I would have never tried that before, and I'm trying to cut back on gluten. They were seriously very good to eat. So if you want to get your first grocery order with Hungry Root for 40% off, be one of the first 100 to click that link down below or use the QR code on the screen and use code Brooke40. With the price of groceries these days, I am so grateful to be able to work with Hungry Root and actually get you 40% off your next grocery order. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1986 in New York, and the Day family lived in Little Falls. This was Charlotte and her husband, Charles, and they had their firstborn, Mary, in 1968, and then came Kathy and Sherry. However, this was not the picture-perfect family at all. All three of the Day girls would be in and out of foster care throughout their childhoods, as it was known that Charlotte wasn't really taking care of them. She was a bit neglectful. It was unknown whether the father was neglectful as well, and he was not really mentioned as far as why these girls were not being looked after and had to go into foster care. I assume that he was at work most of the time. But then Charlotte would divorce Charles, and she would remarry a military man named William Howell. Now, around this time, Charlotte was able to kind of gain more stability and regain custody of her two eldest daughters, Mary and Kathy. Now, Sherry was still in the foster system at this time, but then Charlotte and her second husband had another daughter whom they named Billie Jean. So around 3 years later in 1978, the whole family would end up moving to where Charlotte's second husband was being stationed in the military. This was in Hawaii, and there they would also have a son named William Jr. So in total, they had 4 kids in their custody. They had Charlotte's children from her previous marriage, Mary and Kathy, and then they had Billie Jean and William Jr. from her second marriage. However, Sherry, who remained in foster care, remained in New York. Eventually, the foster parents would permanently adopt her. Now, you would think that it was Sherry who was the child that went missing. However, that was not the case. You see, Mary and Kathy had the ability to return to their mother. However, they weren't the lucky ones. You see, 2 years after moving to Hawaii in 1980, Mary would be back in foster care, the oldest child. It had been found that her stepfather, William, was physically abusing her. So she was taken into protective custody, placed with another foster family she didn't know, now in Hawaii. And although her mother and her biological father was separated and Charles had not gotten the custody taken from him, Mary couldn't be placed in his care at this time because he had died in an accident prior to this. And Charles, due to this accident, had left both Mary and Kathy his inheritance money, but they were still minors, meaning they could not use this to go and live on their own. They were still children who needed care. So then the family would move again because William was being stationed in Seaside, California for his new military base. This time it was just Kathy, Billie Jean, and William Jr. who would go with. Mary was now the one left in foster care in Hawaii. This was said to be extremely hard for her because her and her younger sister Kathy were very close. They actually had talked about using their inheritance money as a way to escape, to run away from home. They even had a code word when they talked about it, referring to their whole plan as Mohawk. But now the sisters were separated and Mary was stranded on an island with nobody she knew. And a few months later, Mary would be sent back to live with her mother, who was still in Seaside, California. And this was on the army base at Fort Ord. So she was finally back together with her sister, and although happy to be reunited with Kathy, Mary was not comforted by being back with her mother and her stepfather. And at this point, documentation of where Mary was and how she was doing was lost. While she was in foster care, everyone knew where she was located. It all ceased when she moved to Seaside, California. She was back with her parents, and there seemed to be no follow-up to see how she was doing, if she needed to be placed in foster care once again. And after her move to the tiny town of Seaside, no trace of her existed. 11 years later, and most people in Seaside had no idea that Mary Louise Day even lived there. They had not seen her then, they had not seen her since. Charlotte and William, according to those who knew them back then, had 3 kids: Kathy, Billie Jean, and William Jr. But then, in 1992, the Fort Ord military base actually received a missing persons report. Finally, after those 11 years. A woman named Sherry Calgaro had gone to California to force the police to look for this girl, Mary Louise Day. She wanted to look into her biological sister's disappearance because Sherry was the one who was placed in foster care and adopted by someone back in New York. But she had since learned that her eldest sister Mary was no longer living with the Days either, and she was not in foster care or had been adopted. You see, Sherry would say that when her mother, Charlotte, had moved to Seaside, California from Hawaii, Sherry had eventually wanted to contact her to get to know her biological family as well. Her adopted family was okay with this, and so she would visit them. However, Mary was never there. So Charlotte would tell Sherry that Mary had run away, she was on drugs, and she had become a sex worker. Charlotte said that they had searched for her and that an APB was actually posted to find Mary, but nothing had been found. But this is when Sherry would be talking to her biological sister, Kathy, who would say they actually weren't allowed to speak about Mary in that house. That all of the photos of Mary had been burnt as though she never existed, but Sherry was told that Mary had run away around July 15th of 1981 when she was 13 years old. She had never returned, and none of her sisters had ever seen her since. Sherry took this at face value, being a young girl herself. She didn't fight her biological mother on this. She didn't really ask any more questions. However, when she had gotten to 18 years old, Sherry was wanting more answers. And so she knew that Mary would have been 21. And so she was talking to her biological mother, Charlotte, and tried to ask her more about Mary. But Sherry ended up being appalled by Charlotte's disregard for Mary's whereabouts whatsoever. And while Sherry never believed that her sister had just simply run away, it wasn't until further questioning with her mother that Sherry feared that the worst had happened. Sherry would tell police that Charlotte had once told her that she knew locations in California where they could hide a corpse. and it would never be found. At this point, Sherry believed that her sister Mary had been murdered all of those years ago by the family that the foster system had allowed her to be sent back to. When doing her own investigating, Sherry would learn that Mary was never reported missing back in 1981. In fact, no one knew there was this 13-year-old living with them who suddenly wasn't there anymore. The Seaside police were even contacted, and they would find no records of this little girl, not even any school records or medical records at all. So Sherry ended up sending the Seaside police a photo of Mary Louise and all of the information she knew about her. However, it had been a decade now since her sister had vanished. But Sherry took this into her own hands at this point, and she ended up contacting the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And in 1999, they would create an age-progressed photo of Mary at the age that she was believed to be around this time, which would have been 31 years old. Finally, in 2002, an official investigation was launched into where Mary Louise Day had gone 21 years prior. However, the only reason that this was done was due to all of the cases regarding Fort Ord, the military base, being reviewed. You see, Fort Ord was being shut down, so all of the cold cases around this military base were being reinvestigated. Seaside investigators would find that Mary was never enrolled in any sort of California schools at any point, and the neighbors of the days when they lived at Fort Ord were tracked down and they were spoken to, and they were shown Mary's pictures, and they couldn't recall ever seeing this little girl. So since the 1980s, no trace of Mary Louise Day existed. There were no IDs, no paychecks, no arrest records. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. There was no trace of her even as an adult. So this is when investigators got in contact with Sherry and Mary's other sister, Kathy, the little girl who remained in the custody of the Days and was there, presumably, when her sister vanished. Now, Kathy would tell investigators that she was kicked out of the home at 14 years old, but Mary had vanished long before that. She was there the night that Mary vanished, in fact, because Kathy would claim that she and Mary were left at home as Charlotte, William, Billie Jean, and William Jr. went out to dinner. They left them home alone and without food, and Mary and Kathy also had the dog with them, and this dog belonged to William, their stepfather. But the dog was sick that night, and when they returned home, William began to blame Mary, telling her that she had poisoned the dog. William began to yell and was beating Mary, and Mary was obviously scared. She was trying to fight back. She started yelling at him too, and Kathy said that the last time that she saw her sister, Mary had blood coming out of her mouth. The next morning, Kathy would wake up and notice that her sister was not in her bed, and she would ask her mother where Mary was, and Charlotte told Kathy to never speak her name again, that Mary had run away. This was the last time that Kathy asked about her sister because she simply wasn't allowed to after that. However, she did have this strange memory of William telling the kids not to go into a specific part of the backyard. It was one of the corners, and so she stayed away, not wanting to get in trouble, especially because the stepfather was known to physically harm the children. So she never went close to this area. She eventually moved out of the home at 14 when she was kicked out and began to live on her own. So that is all the information that Kathy was said to have for these investigators. She too had wondered what had happened to her oldest sister, but she had never been given answers either. So after 2 decades, Charlotte and William were no longer living at Fort Ord, of course, because it had shut down, but they were no longer even in California. They were tracked all the way to Kansas, and William was out of the military at this time and working as a corrections officer at a prison. So Kansas investigators located them and brought them in for questioning, and Charlotte was not cooperative, and in fact, she seemed nonchalant about the entire topic of one of her children vanishing. Though she did seem to have a moment of regret the more they talked and said,
"Where do I start? You know, life is full of regrets. If you go back and say, you know, if I had did this and this and this."
Oh, yes. We've all been there.
Okay. So, this is my problem. I didn't do a lot of things I should have, and I didn't do a lot of things I could have and would have. Now I'm stuck with consequences. I wouldn't talk to either one right now.
Okay.
Because Kathy has got Billie Jean so brainwashed. When Billie Jean calls, The only thing she wants to do is, why don't you find Mary? Where is she? What did you do to her? Blah, blah, blah. And she got her father so upset. She got me so upset.
So, when's the last time you heard from Mary?
81. The last time she ran away.
She ran away, you haven't heard from her since?
No.
Did you guys take any kind of steps to find her?
We should have. We should have.
But you didn't.
I don't think we did. Damn.
Particular reason why?
My husband seems to think we called the police, but no, but there was never a follow-up. You know, they hear the story of the people that fall through the cracks. Mm-hmm. I think that's what happened to her.
She said she didn't remember much, but that after Mary ran away, she and William should have fought harder to find her. The next comment that Charlotte would give an eerie glimpse into the truth. As she stated, if Mary's dead, she's dead. William, on the other hand, Mary's stepfather, was quite talkative, giving a full timeline of the night of the disappearance. He stated they returned home from the dinner. He was checking on the kids when he noticed Mary was not in her bed. He told Charlotte, they panicked, they called the police, although again, there was no record of this. So this is what he stated, that they had already noticed that she was gone by the time that they arrived home. However, that is not what Kathy said. So investigators began to lean towards a theory that Sherry had given them, and that was the fact that at first they weren't going to say that Mary had run away. They weren't going to report her missing because they wanted to keep cashing in her Social Security benefits. Throughout the years, every one of those checks had been cashed. These were the ones she was getting after her biological father died and she was getting the inheritance. As they dug deeper, the theory that this 13-year-old girl had been murdered and no one knew she was even missing for a decade became a real possibility. As they talked further with Mary's stepfather, the more he revealed. William told investigators that he had seen the dog sick that night and he blamed Mary and he got extremely angry and he was viciously beating her, but she was attempting to leave the house. She was kicking him, she was punching him, and so he pushed her. And then he gestured with his hand, showing that he placed her in a chokehold. Now, William denied killing Mary, but said that the next morning Mary was gone. And Charlotte told him that the night prior, she had seen Satan in his eyes, as though he was possessed by a demon. William was then asked, well, if you didn't kill Mary, could that demon inside of you have killed Mary that night? And he said, yes, the demon could have killed her. He said, I couldn't have killed Mary. My body wouldn't have done it, but it wouldn't have been me. It would have been that demonic personality because I blacked out. At this point, investigators had enough to obtain a search warrant for the home that Charlotte and William lived in with their children back in Seaside, California when Mary vanished. And so in 2003, Kathy actually would take investigators to the backyard and pointed them to the corner where she said her stepfather told them was off limits. Cadaver dogs were brought to the scene and they alerted to human remains in the area near a tree. As digging began, investigators would find a shoe, a child-sized tennis shoe near the tree. Kathy said that those were the kind of shoes that they wore as kids. Kathy was witnessing this happen, and she said that it felt like she was opening up a scab and that it hurt. She was just 11 when her sister vanished. But as they kept digging, no remains were found. The cadaver dog handler then began to believe that the remains had been there, but had been moved. And although no remains were found, investigators believed that this was a homicide. Mary had been killed by her stepfather, William, and that her own mother was complicit in covering up the crime. Detective Joe Bertania said that the case was a tangle of weeds and went all different directions, but there was no evidence that Mary was still alive. As investigators built this case against her parents without her body, the unthinkable happened. Mary came home. You see, a month after all of this was discovered and the case was being built, a truck was pulled over in Phoenix, Arizona. On November 25th of 2008, a routine traffic stop found a stolen license plate. So all of the IDs in this car were collected and, of course, scanned through the system to see if they were criminals, they were wanted, anything of the sorts. And as the officer went through the IDs, he got a hit on one of the women's IDs. For Mary Day, a missing woman. Now this was an Arizona ID, but it also had the birth date of the missing California girl. So, of course, Arizona police alerted Seaside, California, and this woman was detained. She told investigators she had run away from home a long time ago to avoid abuse from her mother and stepfather, and she then named them as Charlotte and William Howell. And although this woman had the correct information, investigators were confused at her thick Southern accent. They knew that little Mary never had this. And while looking into this woman who was claiming to be Mary Day, investigators found out why she had never come up during their investigation. It was because the ID that was given to police when they pulled her over, it had only been issued 3 weeks prior to this. A time period that was after the investigators began to build their case of homicide against Mary Louise Day's parents. This was after they stopped searching for documents or activity under that name because they were certain she was deceased. But it was quite an odd coincidence that Mary Day would have waited until 3 weeks ago to get her ID. She was a 35-year-old woman at this point. So the investigators were quite suspicious of this. And Detective Joe Bertana spoke to this Mary on the phone, and he wanted to talk to her about what happened the night she disappeared, to get her story to corroborate with her sister's. And Mary told him that it hurt to talk about. She said she was so confused anymore. She didn't know what was real or not. She remembered that she had her head slammed into the tub and it hurt. The detective asked if that was when she started bleeding, and she said it was, and then her stepfather also hit her head on the coffee table, and she thought after that she'd blacked out. She believed that all of those head traumas were the reason why she couldn't piece together what happened that night. Because Mary didn't mention anything about a sick dog or any of the little details. And again, she had this strange, thick Southern accent, which she claimed to have been in California, Arizona the entire time, which would not have given her this Southern accent. Investigators were so uncertain at this point that this was the real Mary Louise Day that they began to call her Phoenix Mary instead. Then Phoenix Mary asked the detective if they were looking for a body of Mary, how they were going to prove who she was. And when he told her DNA, she said, "Oh, so since I'm still alive, you all can prove who I am." Mary was told by the detective that it was just quite strange, all of this, that it appeared as though she didn't exist up until now, and that is when she began to get very upset, saying, "So I'd be better off if I'm just dead, and then you all can do that detecting from there." So finally, investigators did decide to go ahead and do a DNA test. Phoenix Mary willingly gave her DNA, even though investigators were certain that she was an imposter. The DNA was compared to Mary's mother, Charlotte, and this was done to officially move her out of the investigation so they could go back to the homicide investigation and look for the real Mary's body. The homicide case was officially closed, however, when her DNA was a match. Phoenix Mary was Charlotte's biological daughter. She was their missing and not murdered Mary Louise Day. Mary's sister Sherry, who was the one who instigated all of this, was so excited to have her sister back and actually invited her to come and live with her and her family in North Carolina. Though the more Sherry and their sister Kathy spoke to their grown sister Mary, the fuzzier the truth became. Mary didn't know about her own inheritance that they had nicknamed Mohawk and wanted to use to run away. She also was receiving mail under a different name, and this was Monica Devereaux, the same initials as Mary Day, but definitely not anywhere close. Phoenix Mary told police that she had given up her real name years ago because she was worried she was going to be found. But Sherry was saying that Mary was showing these very odd behaviors, and Sherry believes she might have multiple personality disorder. She said none of the stories that Mary would tell would make sense, and some were told over and over again, but never the same way twice. Mary was said to overdose several times on Tylenol while she lived with Sherry, and she was a heavy drinker, which caused her to be quite violent. She lived with Sherry for about a year before moving out, and she moved back to Arizona, getting married, and then moving to Missouri. However, this was said to be quite an abusive relationship. It was said that her sisters began to get suspicious once again, that maybe this wasn't their sister, it just didn't seem like her. And so 5 years later, in 2008, they didn't really have much contact with Mary, but the Seaside Police Chief would receive a call from Fort Ord, that Army base. Now, cadaver dogs had been there on unrelated matters and had alerted at the second home that this family had lived at while in Seaside, California. They had moved there shortly after Mary vanished. Investigators went to the home, dug that yard up, once again finding nothing. And more DNA tests were done with Phoenix DNA, and her DNA also matched Mary Louise Day's biological father, Charles. But 48 Hours then interviewed her sister Kathy, who claimed that this woman was not her sister Mary. She said something was off, her gut was telling her that, and Kathy said that she had actually found an email that Phoenix Mary had sent or was going to send to the detective, and she had written, "I've been lying to you about who I am." It was never clarified as to what she meant. This is all it said. Investigators today have doubts about this case, and one theory by retired homicide detective Mark Clark is that Charlotte actually had another daughter secretly before her firstborn, Mary, was born, and that she had given up this daughter at birth. So this woman would technically be the biological half-sister of Mary Louise Day. He believes that when Charlotte and William were being investigated for homicide, they contacted this daughter and asked her to assume Mary's identity to make it seem as though she was still alive. That this half-sister might have been bribed into the insurance money that she could receive if she pretended to be Mary Louise Day. There is no evidence to back this up or that there was another birth and another adoption. This is just a theory. But in 2017, Sherry was determined to find the truth once and for all. She learned that Phoenix Mary had late-stage cancer and was on her deathbed. So she and the chief of Seaside Police Department went to visit this woman and to get answers. Mary would tell them that when she first ran away, she met a woman named Maury Kimmel, and that this woman had 2 daughters of her own and kind of took Mary in. She lived with Maury for about a year before leaving and moving from city to city, just traveling around on her own. But Phoenix Mary explained that the reason that she finally got this ID was to get state aid for a surgery on her gallbladder that she needed identification for. So she used a local nonprofit to get her birth certificate for Mary Louise Day. When she was finally asked about this email that she had written to the detective saying she was lying, she said that she herself wasn't sure what she was trying to say. The chief of police would say that she believes that the gaps in Mary's memory were more from trauma and her battle with alcoholism than it was lies. The chief said that Mary seemed like a survivor. And then they tracked down Maury Kimmel. And they asked her if Mary Louise Day had actually stayed with her, if this was the missing girl, if she had run away. And Maury was able to find a photo for investigators that was taken a year after Mary Louise Day was presumably murdered. And this showed her in the photo as a child. It seemed as though this woman was telling the truth. So when this all came out, CBS reporter Maureen Mayer then interviewed the missing Mary Louise Day, who had been found alive after 22 years, but not believed for many more years to come. Mary told her that it was quite frustrating trying to prove to everyone who she was when there was no proof. Mary's sister Sherry then took her daughter and visited Mary, and she finally felt peace at this time that the search was over, that this was her sister. And so they had a brief conversation there. However, Sherry went back home and she tried to call Mary a few times in this care center, and her neighbors refused to let Sherry speak to her. And Mary soon passed away after this, and her sisters weren't informed. So no funeral was held for this woman. It seemed that for decades of Mary's life, she was alone, and now also in death. This woman had endured some of the worst emotional and physical abuse as a 13-year-old. To seem a bit different after all of that trauma and not remember anything is completely feasible, especially due to the head trauma that she claims happened that night she vanished. Then 48 Hours came out with an episode on Mary, and they would take a photo to a face recognition company and found that there was a 99% probability that this was the same person. Although this case has officially been closed and declared as a missing person who had been found. But retired homicide detective Mark Clark still believes that Phoenix Mary was Mary Louise Day's half-sister, who was coerced into pretending to be her murdered half-sister by the killers themselves, and that two killers, or at least one, got away with murder. What do you believe really happened to Mary Day? To me, it's heartbreaking if this really was this missing 13-year-old who ran away from home because she was being so mistreated. Then she had to learn how to survive on her own all of these years with no family members, not even being able to contact them, possibly having some actual trauma and memory loss, and that she just kind of had to fend for herself. And then when they finally said, "This is your family," no one believed her because she was a bit different. If that really was Mary, I can't imagine anguish that she had gone through trying to make people, her own sisters, know that that was still her. She just wasn't the same as that 13-year-old girl. But if this was really a huge scam and these killers came up with this elaborate plan to get away with murder, it's equally as concerning, if not more, that they were able to get away with it. I think it's very hard to fake DNA results being compatible, especially with her biological mother, with her father. When it was just her biological mother, perhaps she did have a secret daughter out there somewhere. However, because this woman also matched her father, Charles, it does seem as though this very much could have been the missing girl that no one wanted to believe. Just imagine that in your head. Reunited with your family after 22 years, for them to say, "That's not her. That's not my sister." Perhaps she did have some sort of multiple personality disorder or different issues from drug use, alcohol use during her time where she was just trying to survive. Because it seems to me that Mary wanted so badly for people to listen and to believe her. It wasn't coming out correctly as she wanted it to. I don't know. I just want to hear your thoughts and theories on this. Do you think it really could be her secret half-sister who covered all of this up? Because the cadaver dogs alerting at both of the homes they stayed in is a bit concerning. There are just so many pieces of evidence that are on guilty and not guilty, that this is Mary Louise Day and that this is an imposter. Truly, I feel like if maybe more evidence needs to come out before we actually make a statement on how we feel about this, but this is all that has been released about this case. So let me know what you think down below, and don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.